Mr Prichard, as you know, we've previously interviewed several eminent scholars whose connections with the faculty extend back to the Second World War, and these are a valuable source of information on what was a time of great change. And you've been associated with the faculty for over 60 years, and I hope you'll be able to provide us with further reminiscences on this intriguing period. Also, as we talk about your own career, I'm sure you will give us many insights into the evolution of the teaching of law at Cambridge and the many personalities that you've met over the following half-century during your time at Gonville and Caius. And finally, I hope that we can visit some of your own research topics that I know include inter alia admiralty law and tort. So can we start by talking about your early life in pre-war England? You were born in 1927 in Banstead, Surrey, near Epsom.
Yes, that's true, yes.
Is this where you spent your childhood?
No, well, we moved from there fairly soon thereafter to Wimbledon because with three brothers, the four of us, we all went to the Jesuit school, Wimbledon College. It's called a college, though it's really a school, but it's a college because all the Jesuit schools are called colleges. But it was a very leading sort of teaching, it's called a faith school today, but of course in those days it was just sort of a Jesuit school. And so we moved to Wimbledon, and then shortly before the war, just before the war, in fact, that's the Second World War, we moved back to Sutton, fairly close to Banstead, because my father, who'd been fairly gassed in the First World War, felt needed to live on curious enough chalk and high ground, and England, Wimbledon was a little too damp and low, so we moved back there. But it meant, of course, daily travelling across from Sutton all the way to Wimbledon. And during the war included mostly. But before the war, I mean also too, but vividly one remembers it during the war, travelling across each day. But
was this a religious, this was a religious school?
It's Jesuit, yes. Under the 1944 Act they had to discuss it, because before that it had really been a private school, though of course being Jesuit school, the fees were very low, and they weren't very low, but it became a sort of maintained school in 1944, so that, but that was the Butler, Education Act. But I was there until 1945, in fact, and left in 45.
What subjects did you excel at, Mr Prichard?
Well, I don't know about excelling, but no, the one I tended to be on the on the literary side, arts side, rather than science side. I like to excuse myself on that I've always been interested in some of the science things, that it was virtually impossible to get any scientific materials. For instance, chemistry, you could hardly any teaching during the war, because you simply couldn't get hold of chemists, so that I never took to that in the slightest. Physics tended to have to be more the mathematical side of statics and dynamics and the rest, rather than anything else. But it was mostly classics, and then history and French. So at actual Vauxhall School certificate level, it was all fairly equally 8 subjects we had to do. They were all fairly equal. And then one had to choose to go into. Well, the Jesuits were very keen on one going on to the classic side. They're not actually Latin and Greek. I mean, I continued to do Latin, but not as a regret that I never really mastered Greek. Latin came in very useful a little later, as we will see.
I gathered, yes. I thought that your
during the war, that was it, you see. I can still vividly remember we would travel over in the bus. And occasionally the bus would stop and we'd all have to get out and go for the nearest shelter. That was in the early years, yes, so in the bonds where, so we were going across in the bond. It's all right, nothing came very close to us. In Sutton was very close to where we were. It was up
very
to
interesting.
It was very close to Croydon Aerodrome. But
you would have been 12 years old when war actually broke out.
Yes, yes. So it was
And-
really very, as it were, they were very impressionable years. Those 6 years, or 6 years were.
Yes.
Yes. I'm not doing it, but it rather messed up study a good deal. Because even during the war, one was sort of the sirens would go, and when we go down to the shelters in the middle.
Incredible.
But, we had decided, at the very beginning of the war, we had 4 of us. The eldest one was a territorial, so he was called up on the day, actually before war was declared. But the 3 of us, mother and father, agreed that since Dad would have to stay in London for his work, Mother was very keen to stay there too. I preferred that we should all stay on the ground that we would stay or go together. So we weren't evacuated at all, and Wimbledon College wasn't evacuated, unlike many schools, because in fact it was felt that the Jesuits would stay there, and so they did. Yes.
Were there any other deprivations that you recall?
Not. Well, I mean, there were books were difficult, and things like sort of, as it were, exercise books and papers had to be kept fairly frugally because they weren't easily replaced. But no, I mean, I think we were probably healthier during the war, but we fairly, as it were, sparse rations.
Did you witness?
Much better, in fact. I think, yes. But,
witness any serious bombing?
Nothing very much at the school, no. I mean, the school didn't go hit at all in the slightest. No, it was because we weren't over in the East End or anything of London. It was much more at night when it was much more over the whole of the city, but we were still on the suburbs, and I don't want to over-dramatise it. But there was some, 1 or 2 fairly close, not just near, put it this way, near enough at home to blow out the windows of the houses, the glass from the houses. So my brothers and I tended to spend our evenings going around to houses, replacing panes of glass and things. Yeah, but nothing dramatic at all. And I was too young to go in, just too young. I didn't get to my sort of medical for call up until early 45. In fact, effectively, when the war was virtually over by that time, and they decided they could do without me, that I should be more trouble medically to them than. So I wasn't called up for national service.
Did you feel that you'd been spared?
Well, no, not really. I think a bit disappointed in some ways, but because that was the sort of spirit. But very happy, really, to sort of. It meant that my father very luckily got us I got into King's College London. Actually, my elder brother, who was by that time not the eldest, who was serving throughout the war, but my second brother Brian, who became a legal solicitor in London, he was still in the Navy. So curiously enough, although I was the 3rd child, I was the first to go through King's London, and then Brian followed, and then Alan, who later became professor of law at Nottingham. We all read law at King's London immediately after the war, under Harold Potter.
Right.
And that was that's a slightly different experience,
Yes.
but a very vivid one, I may say. Yes. Do you want to move on to that one?
Well,
it's up to you.
Yes. Just before we do, in general, did the war affect your outlook on life in any way? I know that it did for Professor Allett. It had a fairly profound effect on the way he viewed the world.
I don't think so, no. I think it was fairly young, so it was all very exciting. I know that sounds so ridiculous nowadays, but one would, as boys, one would plot the flow and fallback of the German troops in Russia, so one learned it makes you say, a good deal of geography.
Yes.
But,
yes.
Apart from that, general worries, and of course my brothers were serving, but not really. No, I didn't think so. But it's at the age of a boy, at the age of sort of 12 to 16, 17, much more interested in that sort of thing, you know.
Yes.
And yes, no, but apart from that, not really, I don't think.
And when you moved to London, did you find that this was very different to where you grew up and had been to school? I mean, was London...
Oh, London, well, first of all, King's London, it was immediately after the war, and the whole place was still, King's London was still badly damaged. That was in Somerset House, part of them, that had been bombed, part of that. So, but King's was carrying on remarkably well, but in just the narrow eastern third of Somerset House, with the Inland Revenue on the Somerset, the main part of Somerset House. No, and lectures and supervisions were very packed into a small space.
It must have been a strange mix, because you had a lot of these people returning from the war who were much more experienced.
Yes, in the first year there were very largely actually prisoners of war returning,
Really?
including those from the Far East. But there were, yes, quite a lot of those, yes. And wartime and people from the services. He was relatively one of the young ones, not the only, there were others too who had come up, you see, because at that stage they didn't really want a lot more national service. They tended to come in a little bit later here at this stage, 45. They were mostly trying to cope with the large number of people who need demobilisation.
Right.
But yes, it was really, I should perhaps explain, King's London was one, really the teaching was very much organised with two other colleges, University College London and LSE, so we would have to travel between the three for lectures. I still remember you would get on a bus to go up to, as it were, the godless institution of Gower Street, which is how we referred to University College, but one would have some lectures there. But it had the enormous advantage that one got lectures from all the very good the law professors, the outstanding people in London, not just in King's London, so that if I can just rattle through them a bit, you see, I can still vividly remember them all. In fact, one does tend to remember things at that age. It's an exciting change, and it's law, it's the first thing, it's a completely new subject to one, and one doesn't trip. But at King's itself, I was the dean of the faculty was Harold Potter. I'll come back to him, who, as it were, instilled in all us boys, I think, a sort of love of the law, as it were, just not so much a technical brilliance, but rather just passionate interest in law and what it should do for society. And so there was Harold Potter, and he had a relatively small but very hard-working staff. There was Albert Caralfi, and there was notes on evidence and things,
Right.
quite a number. And supervisions tended, of course, to be, they weren't supervisions like Cambridge, they were all in 8s and 10s, and they were really just groups who were looking at puzzle problems, and cases, and discussing cases. But I remember the most, the one who would drive us hardest in supervision later, only came for a year from Oxford, where he'd been using him, was Fleming. And I remember myself, when Fleming returned as Goodhart Professor, we had some very pleasant times chatting about what life was like then. But I do remember, if I can say that, some lecturers would come and be in King's, for instance, Potters that were in King's. David Hughes Parry would come over from London School of Economics, which really just showed how hard people were pressed in those days, because he was also Vice Chancellor of the university, but at the same time full-time professor and lecturing like any other professor.
Was that Clive Parry?
No, not Clive Parry.
No,
Hughes Parry, David Hughes
Right,
Parry.
right.
No relation to Clive,
Yeah.
but Hughes Parry. But he would come over and lecture. His lectures were always extremely clear. Potter's lectures weren't clear, but they were exciting. But to give you some flavour of it, I mean, he would lecture on land law, and there was no question of, as it were, concessions to the weak. The first lecture was really upon types of ownership, and the second one, though it won't mean much to anything else, was on the powers of the estate owner under the Settled Land Act, and that was my second lecture on land law. Well, anybody who knew land law or knows the history of land law at all, the powers of the settled land and the owner under the Settled Land Act are not the easiest topic to the secondary. Yes, particularly when they were concerned with raising money. But that was the second lecture. Then we also had, I should mention them straight off, we had at London School of Economics, we had Glanville Williams. I'll return to him for a moment, in a moment, but he was there. And the other one who sticks out in my mind, were two at University College. There was George Keaton on equity, but the one who really sticks in my mind from there was Professor Jolowitz. That's Tony's father.
Right.
Was quite a remarkable scholar, and taught us Roman law and taught me all the Roman law I ever knew, because he was really a quite exceptional lecturer and very keen and extremely conscientious in his lectures and everything. For years I used to rely on his notes entirely, in fact. Then at third year we returned to him, and he gave me the best lectures I ever attended on jurisprudence.
Goodness.
It was more on the historical side,
Yes.
because I tended, let's say, to like the historical side.
He'd been in intelligence.
Yes, he had.
Yes.
I didn't know that at the time. But you see, all of them were coming back. For instance, Graveson, when he came back to King's, had to lecture in his army uniform for the first few lectures. We hadn't got his demob clothes. I mean, they came straight back out and straight into lecturing. He was a reader at that stage. And we also had one very nice person called Kitson, who was an RAF pilot who had been blinded in the RAF, so his wife had to come and sit with him while he lectured. But he unfortunately didn't stay in the lecturing. He was very good, very conscientious, but since he really needed an amanuensis and the King's London couldn't afford that, he went into the civil service. But you see, I have an admiration for these, and affection for these people, because they were pitchforked into it, at the deep
Yes.
end. If you can pitchfork somebody into the deep end, they were tossed in at the deep end. And it really, very few of them had been there during the war. Some had, but not, and the older ones had. But some were coming back. There we are. The young one I'm just saying was Glanville Williams, and he was at London School of Economics. I was lucky enough to have him in the first year lecturing on constitutional law, and he was remarkably good, quite remarkably good. And then in the second year I was even more fortunate to have him in criminal law, and it still is quite exciting to remember, as it were, how one became aware of the distinction between intention and recklessness and negligence and things, concepts like this, but they're all very precisely and clearly expounded. Just as in constitutional law, my first acquaintance with Venn diagrams was Glanville Williams explaining the non-separation of powers in this country. But in constitutional law, of course, in those days, you see, the third term was still devoted to quite what now would be almost unintelligible to people. It was still devoted to the Empire and Commonwealth, and so where Glanville was extremely good was on the difference of in the constitutions of Canada and the constitutions of Australia. But of course, that's fairly soon. The whole of the Commonwealth changed, but that was 1/3 term of the.
Really?
In college, we were lucky enough to have Hood Phillips, actually, who had actually done, curiously, a work here in Cambridge with Wade and Phillips on constitutional law. So we were really very lucky there. But as I say, Glanville Williams turned when he did a subject, it was quite interesting. When he was asked to lecture on a subject, or became later, for instance, Quain Professor of Jurisprudence, he would write a book on the subject, more or less, and then started off the criminal law one. He would switch from constitutional law to criminal law before he had time to write a book on constitutional law.
Interesting.
But on criminal law, of course, the early lectures, and without the slightest disrespect to him, he later became very much more concerned with the penal side of it and the effects of it, which are excellent, But for first year, for lawyers, young, starting off, when he was very purely concerned with analysing the concept of the criminal law, they were very, very... So while I was at London, I was really rather privileged to have these.
Absolutely.
They're the eminent scholars I remember from just after the war.
Well, I'm fascinated by what you say, particularly the module in constitutional law that focused on Australian constitutional law.
Well,
what a far cry from today. I mean, we seem to have moved so far away.
But also, too, you say you had to deal with the difference between protectorates and dependencies and crown colonies and things of this sort, because they were all there, you see. But as regards the constitutional law itself, it was very much more, of course, constitutional law hadn't yet really changed in the sense that judicial review had not really developed. One still had the old royal orders of mandamus and certiorari, but they hadn't been, as it were, changed into judicial review, which was 10 years later.
And I'm wondering, Mr Prichard, what prompted you then to apply to do an LLB at Queen's?
Ah, yes. In fact, I'd done rather well in the examinations there at London, and Harold Potter saw that I was sort of quite interested on the academic side, much more interested on the academic side, and it was he who persuaded me to apply for the Cambridge LLB. It was all a question for a long time. It was a question of whether one could possibly afford it, because there's no question at those stages of grants to go to university. You paid your own fees, and we didn't. Mother and father had three of us, as it were, or four of us in actual fact. But luckily, I managed to get enough scholarships from various places. King's were very good. I got a postgraduate scholarship there, and they allowed me to hold it at Cambridge. Gray's I was at Gray's Inn by that time, because Harold Potter sent all his King's people to Gray's Inn. But they give me a scholarship there, studied law. And then, in fact, my first contact with Cambridge was that Harold Potter suggested I sort of get in touch with Emlyn Wade, who was a great friend of Harold Potter, and Emlyn became very interested and got me to apply for a Squire Law scholarship, which was, and I remember the first letter I ever got from the faculty was one from Kurt Lipstein, who was, in fact, I've still got the letter, telling me that I had been awarded a Squire Law scholarship. It was £60 a year, but it made all the difference. And that was my first communication from the faculty. So I came up to Queen's because Emlyn Wade and Harold Potter suggested I should try and go to Queen's, where Arthur Armitage was there. He was very dynamic in the lead. So I went up to Queen's to meet the LLB. That was 2 years. You had to do 2 years for any degree in Cambridge. So you took the exam in 1 year, and the next year you did some research, but you had to. Others later sort of repeated by doing the tripos. They repeated what they'd done at King's at London, and then did the LLB in the second of the 2 years. But that was thought to be not really quite the right way to spend the year when I was there, so we went straight to the LLB, and I was at Queen's then. It was too late being applied because I only got my results in London in sort of July in 1945, and I came up in 1948. You see, in 45 to 48, I was at King's London. I'd only got in July 48, and then so I had to make my application, get in. Working as always during the summer, as I said, it was still hard at work in August and September. In September, I wrote and said I could have this Squire scholarship. And Arthur Armitage at the last moment managed to find me room to get into Queen's. But of course, we couldn't live in college in Queen's because it was all full by that time. So I went up to Queen's for 2 years. But it was a very, turning to that for one moment, the real staggering difference between going to London and coming to Cambridge, I can still remember it, was that the day was 3 hours longer. Straight away, the day was 3 hours longer, because you see in London, no lecture could start before 10 at the earliest to allow. It was an hour and a half to travel up to London immediately after the war, bus interruption. So you would leave soon after 8 in order to get for a 10 o'clock lecture. And no lecture went on, no supervision or anything went on beyond 3:30, because students had to get, on the whole, might go on to 4 o'clock, but you needed to get away before the ordinary workers of the, because the traffic became so jammed. It was all jamming on the buses and undergrounds, and they had to get home because many of them lived out. I mean, Keith, for instance, lived out in Berkhamsted, and Potter lived out in Royston, or near Royston. So that, and then you came up to Cambridge and found, they were literally, literally is the wrong word, but there were sort of 3 hours extra a day for students. I mean, you could study the Squire Law Library up until just before 7, and then walk round to back to Hall in Queen's.
Was that delightful, Mr Prichard?
Oh, it was just a complete change. What it meant one had time in the library, whereas at King's London one had very little time in the library. Almost all you had to see, most of your information had to come from lectures and supervision. You had, in many cases, you had to take on trust. There'd only be the odd copy, things were short and things. And that's why one came to appreciate very much lecturers like Dolowitz and Neville Williams, who put an enormous amount of time on their lectures, and to make sure they were good. But while I'm still down in London, I remember with Gonville Williams, I was extremely impressed at that time. As a young man, he was not a great sense of humour in lecture or anything like this, you see, but he encouraged questions, but they had to be genuine questions. If it was just show-off questions, he would put them down very much. But if it was a genuine question, he would stop the lecture and write a note, a careful note, that this was a point which had caused genuine concern. The result is that after about 2 or 3 years, his lectures had ceased to be the stuff that might bore us all, because we got it, but it was the points which might trip us up or anything, so that, as it were, more and more came into the lectures of what was upsetting the student or what was puzzling the student. And of course they got better and better for that reason. I was always impressed with that. He would always stop and make a note of it, and not just sort of deal with it. He would always deal with it, but or say, I'll come back to this one, because sometimes he said, we're going to deal with this. But as I say, transform the lectures in the course of about 2 or 3. The one he gave us 3 years after he gave his first one, type of thing, had changed quite remarkably, because they were good to start with, but the first one was writing down very much, because what would now be the textbook stuff. And 3 years later, he would be lecturing on the points that trouble the student.
Almost like the beginnings of a case-based approach.
Well, yeah, but it wasn't necessarily case-based. No. It was just explaining a concept or something like this. Yes, no, and it was very good. But there we are. Yes. But coming back to Cambridge, you see, I mean, it was totally different. I mean, supervisions were different. Not that we had any supervision in the LLB, and there weren't very many lecturers at that stage. It was a fairly lonely existence in that sense, because two papers on legal history, and there wasn't any, and then I did Ministry of Law, which was with Emlyn Wade, and comparative English and Roman law, or transfer of movables, as well as under J.W.C. Turner. And those were 4 papers, but there was no supervision at all. But one was lucky at Queen's, because there were 3 other extraordinarily good students at the time, exactly the same, not doing my subjects, nobody else did it, but there was Bill Wedderburn. Right. He was there at Queen's doing the LLB at my time, and there was David Widdicombe, who later became Liberal MP for Widdicombe for Widdicombe, and then there was Newey, John Newey, who later became a master of the hangman. And they were all very good. There were 4 very good. Well, all of us, you see. So Queen's had quite a good, Arthur Armitage had got us a very nice, good stable of people there at that stage. So that was very great fun, and they were interesting, and it meant that in meetings of the Cambridge, of the Queen's Bench, was very interesting. They still stick in my mind. We used to meet in Arthur's room. Yes. You
met in Arthur Armitage's room.
Room over before in the evenings.
Right.
If it was like, sometimes it was larger, and we would have to go into a hall or something like this. But Arthur would still, you see, in those days he was back. Of course, he'd come back in '45 at the time when I was at King's London. But he'd been away during the war, of course, too. You see, like so many of them, Dick Goodis, John Thorne. So they were all the, if you like, the returning ones after the war. They were the older ones who had stayed in Cambridge. Yes, but no, yes, the LLB was quite. It was an interesting period.
Who were your mentors during this period, Mr. Prichard?
Well, one was mostly, the LLB was very largely left to oneself. Right. Very largely left to oneself. Harry Holland did the legal history lectures, though in fact actually, again, just as Glanville Williams' lectures at London stood out, and so did Harold Potter's, but they stood out particularly, Glanville's and Potter's at London. At Cambridge, I do remember I was privileged to attend Toby Milsom's first lecture. He was just back as a research fellow at Trinity, and they were trying him out for lectures, and so I attended his first lectures on action on the case, which was very exciting, because it was totally new, totally different from everything we'd learned beforehand. Everything in action on the case wasn't action in like case, it was action quite totally different approach to it. No, I remember that was very exciting. Taking the LLB examination was really quite amusing, because in those days, in that time, we had an extraordinarily good provision in the rubric for the examination was answer up to 4 questions, but whether you answered 1 or 4 was entirely left to you. And I do remember one of the legal history papers, and I spent the whole 3 hours writing on action on the case. It seemed to have but I still remember Toby's lectures. So
he inspired you.
Pardon?
He inspired you.
Oh, yeah, and legal history. Yes, I was already interested in legal history very much, because I've been in history, been the main subject at school. In fact, yes. No, they were in a little room called Room 7 in the Squire Law, down in the old, law school. That was the small one. The first of the ones I think we lost to some coffee room or something for the staff. It's the downstairs of the lift, the lift of the Regent House. But no lectures were all there, of course.
Well, Toby Milson would have been about 26 years old at the time.
I couldn't. I mean,
he was born in 1923.
23.
So we're talking about 1949.
No, a bit younger than 26, wouldn't he? 23. Oh, yes. You say 20. We're talking about 49.
Yes.
So, and he was born. Yes, no, 23. You see, not 26, wouldn't
right.
he?
Yes, even younger.
Oh, no, hold on. 23, no, yes, 26, yes, no, 26, yes, yes. Oh, yes,
So
yes. But he looked very young, as it were.
Yeah.
He was very young, and
Yes.
were great fun, and he was a great lecturer in that sense.
He's a lovely man.
There was a totally different type of lecturer. They were always put very tentatively and not stutteringly, but hesitantly. But you could see the mind at work, as it were. Very good.
And that lovely laugh.
Yes. It was fun. That was it really was fun.
In fact,
if I could just interpret that one later, a year later, because, or 2 years later, I used to go to his lectures, even though I'd taken the exam and finished. I would always go along to his lectures. I remember the Harry Holland sort of had arranged for him, he was giving his lecture. And that morning, it was going to be on the Court of Exchequer, in the time of Henry II and Henry III. He was going to give this lecture. It was just a standard lecture on the subject he was working on. And Harry used the usual way sort of announced that his friend Jenkinson, Sir Hilary Jenkinson, was up in Cambridge, so he was going to come to the lecture. He was all coming to the lectures, and he came to his lecture. Now, Hilary Jenkinson had written the book on select pleas on the Exchequer, and so you were going to lecture to the man who knew more. And I'm glad to say that Toby, with lecture notes on the Exchequer in front of him, sort of switched his subject to the last moment onto the King's Bench. And I remember his revealing afterwards, he said, I hope that wasn't... But he didn't, quite rightly, he didn't dare lecture on the King. But there we are, yes, they were fun, as it were, they were good fun, yes. But,
do you know, Mr Prichard, you used the word fun, and that crops up, that word. I don't know how many times in the interviews I did with Toby.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And that was very important to him, I think, in his appreciation of life.
It was fun. It's fun time anyways. I mean, any argument is people trying to work out what happened, because it was largely detective work as well. You've got a similar sense of not quite fun but excitement, and from Harold Potter too. They were very exciting that way. As I say, Gonville was in a much more purely intellectual way. It was still, it was exciting rather than fun, but with Toby it was fun. Fun all the way. And, but not in a light heart, I mean, very, yes. Oh no,
yes.
But that was the LLB. I don't think what I remember at Queen's was because sometimes people have asked, and you may well ask me, well, how do you fit in from what might be called just not really even a grammar school boy, but a maintained schoolboy from London coming into Cambridge? Well, it was actually quite, I suppose I was lucky in a way, in the sense that, of course, many of my colleagues were ex-service. They were straight demobbed, and at that stage, they were given places at the university, so that Queen's was... I never had the slightest feeling that one was a sort of, lower working class boy or something. There was no class distinctions. It was very striking. But looking back, one puts it very much on the fact that it was, the Queen's was at that stage, we were completely full of people from all sorts of different backgrounds who had served in the forces, because most of them, the great many of them, were youngsters, not much older than myself, but a little bit older, some of them, and they had they'd come from all walks of life beforehand. Yes. No, those were very good days at Queen's.
I mean, that was 60 years ago that you first came, 60 years ago you first came to Cambridge.
No, 63 years ago.
63
well,
years.
19... 1948.
Correct.
Well, it's 64 years now, isn't it?
A hugely different place to today.
In some ways, life was hugely different, I think, rather than the place. I can't really, I think there was far less, well, looking ahead, because I went from Queen's to Keys in 1950 straight away as a fellow of the college. There was less specialisation, much less specialisation. There were people who were outstanding distinguished in their own subject, but lecturers, for example, as in London, when they lectured on what they had to lecture on when they came up, when they came back from the forces and the rest. And, one of the things the chairman of the faculty and the secretary had to do was organise the lecture list. And, they had to decide somebody's got to lecture on this subject. And, yes, I may say that when I went over to Keys as a fellow in 1950, I hadn't got the university post until the following year. But in the college, there were about, I think, not the first year, but the second year, there were 50 students. Because they'd been moved, some had been doing 2 years economics for the first year and then law and the rest, but there were 50 of them. There was nobody else, as it were, so one did the teaching or got weekenders to do it.
Right.
So you would owe quite a lot by having to learn the subject the night before, but teach them in supervision, as it were. But, yes, and that happened at the university level too. People like they were very rarely, unless they were at professorial level or readership level, able to lecture on the subject they were really keen on. Relatively few of them. People like John Thornley and Mickey Dias in particular, would be called on to do almost anything.
Really?
I may say that when I got my assistant lectureship, they decided that they wanted a lecturer in the LLB course on transfer of movables, of course, you might say I'd taken the course before, but then they decided to switch it to, as it were, negligence in English and Roman law. But they said, well, you did Roman law. And so from having done a one-year course first year course on Roman law, luckily with Jolliffe's father Jolliff down in London, to be switched to using that for LLB lectures, and particularly, as I still remember to my horror, in the audience was Geoffrey Wilson, who had just got the George Long Prize for Roman law and everything else, and he would sit in the back like this, you see. Well, but he's a Queen's man. It was fun, but that's what happened. I'm not playing them myself, but all of them. Everybody had to switch from one subject to another. There just weren't all that many. And of course, but the faculty for many years, I suppose it's very different from now, of course, but for many years, it was the Squire Law Library was the heart and soul of the place. And moving on from 48, Queen's to Keys. The Squire Law Library, the old Squire, which you will remember, or do you remember it?
Just
the upstairs of the old Squire, not the downstairs. The downstairs was the history library, but all the law lectures took place in very nice lecture rooms in the old schools, with wood benches which had been put in just before the war.
Really?
So in fact, looking back on it, I suppose I didn't realise at the time, it just looks as if the law faculty had always been there, but it had only been there for about 4 years before the Second World War, so that people like Kurt and all the others remembered it when it was in the Downing Street site,
yes.
The Museum of Ark and Ants.
Yes.
Over there, and but I don't remember that at all. But the Squire, it all seemed home, as it were. But also, it was, looking back a little, as it were, not sadly, but it was fondly. The faculty was very much a sort of closely knit body, even though we all had colleges.
Right.
And most of the faculty would try and get in for tea in the morning at 11 o'clock. Many lectures would be 9 till 10, from 10 till 11, and then 11 to 12. I mean, not all of them, I mean, and consequently, those who were lecturing from 10 to 11 would come in at 11 until just stay there for tea for about 10 past before they went back to their colleges. And those who were going to lecture at 11 would come at about 10 too. But others who had been upstairs would always come down. I mean, Kurt, for instance, who was inevitably up in room 5. I'll come back to him in a moment. But room 5 in the upstairs Squire, he'd come down for tea, and that was where really most of the faculty business was done. And one would talk about the latest case or the argument, and visitors to the faculty would come too. And that took place in the old lecturers' combination room, which was right down, later became, I think, lecture room 2 or 3, down downstairs. It was always tea, and made out of an enormous great pot by the lady cleaner to clean. But it was, it was good, because I remember people like Bill Wedderburn would always come in. One could always argue a case with him. He was always very good at that. He was young, like myself. Pardon?
This was when you were lecturing, Mr. Prichard,
Yes,
rather than a student.
Yes, this is after 50. Yes,
after 50.
Oh, before 48 to 50,
Yes.
one was just a student,
Yes,
one went to lectures and things.
you
It was still in
didn't
the
see the
same place,
Yes.
and the lectures were still about. But from 50 onwards, when I was to get, no, Hirsch Lauterpacht would always be up in his room 6 in the old Squire. Almost every day would come in very early, and Kurt would be in 5. But they were always very good at coming down, and others would be there. And many would come along from other colleges. I'm not saying necessarily from the furthest flung colleges, but they were very good at coming. I mean, they would come along from Johns, Jackson would come along, Bailey would come along, later Scott. And that kept going, you see, so that John Hall, for example, but that's jumping ahead for years. That kept going for quite a long time, the whole of the 50s really, and the early 60s. In the middle of the 60s, the coffee tradition took over, and since the lady cleaner couldn't really cope with coffee, because it had to be couldn't stand getting stewing as the tea could, because the younger members of the faculty tended to drift off into the Regent House upstairs for coffee, and so the tea habit rather broke down. But in the early days, I remember people like Jack Hampson would always come in, and Kurt would come down. And, yes, they would come almost as a matter of course. They would somehow, so that the faculty as well had a sort of collegiate spirit as well as a college. In fact, I think we were probably better organised as a faculty. No, not better organised, the wrong word, but more cohesive as a faculty than most of the other arts faculties. Not the science faculties, of course, because they all had their laboratories and departments, and then chemistry within the chemistry building, and so on and so forth. But whereas history tended to be scattered, because history didn't have a similar, although it had the Seeley History Library below us in the old schools, none of his lectures were there. Before the war, Harry Holland and Bill and Arnold McNair had organised that the law faculty would get the old schools. They were lovely lecture rooms. When the university library moved to over the river to the big building, we shared it with the administration. And we had all our lectures there, and the administration hadn't started to trespass and encroach in a way. That really came with the 60s, but the 50s were very much that of
this would have been the period from 1950
to about 60 sort of approach. I'm thinking of that was the period when, as it were, it was still a small, fairly compact faculty. I remember, actually, although some of the giants had retired by that time, well, I remember when I was, but that's where Percy Winfield was still there.
Really?
He wouldn't have, by that time he'd retired. But I remember his last few lectures, but because I used to go to them when I was but that was only when I was a student.
Yes.
But most of it was still a fairly small faculty, and it was
Yes.
still very much in the law. It was the law school. I never talked about the old schools. I talked about the law school, as it were. And for example, the criminology, which is now a building of its own and has been there, used to be in a tiny little room. The whole of criminology kept in a tiny little room up on the the west end of the North Gallery in the Squire Law Library.
Goodness.
If you ever saw that room, it's now used as a little storeroom, because there's a tiny window. But that was where it was, you see, because of course it started up there because J.W.C. Turner was still very largely concerned with it. Radzig just arriving, and then it started to expand and develop.
Yes.
But that was in the 50s, yes.
And Mr. Prichard, did you decide at that stage, after you graduated, that you wanted to become an academic?
Yes. It was a very tempting offer. I mean, I think I would have. I was torn between that and practice, I have to say. I think I would have been. I'll explain in a moment that I was lucky in some ways to have both. But no, I was offered a fellowship while I was still a student at Queen's and Key's fellowship. It was really rather nice to live in college for the first time. So I became a fellow at the college. I got my university post rather rapidly after that. But I should say straight away that even though I was the only law fellow at the time, because of course Eminem Wade was professor, and Arnold McNair had retired, though he was still very much a figure in Cambridge, having come back. He'd come back from Liverpool where he was Vice Chancellor, but he didn't come back to a chair at all, because by that time Coach Mountebank had his chair. Hirsch and
Sorry, Mr. Prichard, just open the window. Sorry, just a bit noisy from the students.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, Emlyn and Arnold, and very strongly Arnold, were extremely good, because they persuaded the college that the law done at the college ought to have, as well, some sort of professional. He ought to. I was already a member of the bar, Gray's Inn, but he said, no, you should go and have some experience. So even though I held a fellowship, the college, entirely on their persuasion, and they were very persuasive people, particularly Arnold McNair, I was very sorry. The college allowed me to do my teaching, and it had to be 12-hour supervision a week in those days.
Quite
12 hours. At the weekend, and spend the week down in chambers in London, reading in chambers. And I had the particular privilege of spending a whole year. It was supposed to be 6 months, but in 6 months in equity and 6 months, 6 months in Chancery and 6 months in common law, but we stayed the whole 12 months. And I had the great privilege of being under John Brunyate, who was counsel. He was very disabled and he couldn't hardly walk, but he had a brilliant mind. He'd been a fellow, mathematic fellow of a mathematician at Trinity. He'd been a very distinguished prize fellow at Trinity and written the work on charity. But he was the great intellectual in the Chancery Division. You didn't go into court much, and he wasn't a QC simply because he couldn't get about much. He was very disabled, but he was deferred to very much by counsel. So I very lucky. They got me into as John Brunyate's pupil in Lord in Upjohn's chambers, 4 stone buildings. I'll mention that for a particular reason. And it was a very happy year there. Fortunately, my parents were still living down well, not in Sutton, they moved to Epsom at that stage. So that during the week I could go and stay there at night and just come back and teach at the weekends. Quite a lot to teach.
Life.
But then it was quite, yes, it was very pleasant. But mostly because I may not have done well at the bar, but I would have enjoyed the life. The life was very, very much the same. That particularly in chancery chambers like 4 stone buildings, where it was, again they would have tea in the afternoon and they would discuss some problem. Obviously not professional competency thing, but some intellectual problem which would have arisen, as it were, and they would toss it around chambers. And occasionally Upjohn, who'd gone to the bench, would come back for tea and say, "Was I all right today?" He would ask John, "Was I right this morning?" Which is rather amusing. You see, they all rather sort of assume that they must pass. But, yes, so that I think I would have been as happy, and they were quite keen to keep me, as it were. But I'd only got the year off from Keys. I think that was 52, 53, something. And I got my lectureship by that time, so it was fairly heavy.
Yes. Goodness.
But going back to the faculty, you see, I don't think people didn't work as hard in the sense that they weren't rushing around so much. But they spent the hours enormously. For example, you see, everybody would have to, or most people would supervise a lecture on the Saturday morning. In fact, 2 sets of lectures were always given. I mean, Roman Dutch law, which we used to teach, was always given on Saturday morning.
Do you remember who taught that?
Well, the one who sticks in my mind was a bit later because I had to organise mine. It was Coulson. Coulson did the Roman Dutch law. And then for a number of years we had Scots law, and that was Ashton Cross, who used to come down from Scotland.
Goodness.
But that would be on Friday afternoons and Saturday mornings. But Scottish law sticks in my mind because, of course, it used to attract a number of Scots down.
Yes.
There are quite a number of Scots in the faculty who stay, and they used to do Scots law. In fact, Tony Weir, I think, took over the lectures on it. I have to say, it was always we always thought the Scots was not very, very well because they would do 1 year's Scots law, as it were. They were supposed to do 5 subjects spread over the tripos. We always thought it was a bit of a fraud that one paper was Introduction to Contract and Tort, the second paper was Contract, the third paper was Tort, the fourth paper was Scots Law of Contract, and the fifth paper was the Scots Law of Tort. So that in fact they got away with 2 subjects, Contract and Tort, whereas everybody else had to do 5 very different subjects. But there we are, that's Simon. I used to pull Tony Weir's leg on this one.
Well, that reminds me of someone I wanted to ask you about who came in 1949, and that was Peter Stein. He was at, of course, your college at Gonville and Keys.
49. He was earlier than that as an undergraduate, wasn't he? I think he graduated by 48, I think, because he wasn't my student. Peter was always senior to me in this, but I'd have to look him up. But he came back to do the LLB, but not in residence, I don't think. He was there. Sorry, he may have been at Queen's at 40. He may have been at Keys at 49. 49 to 50.
Yes.
But that's right. Sorry, yes. But that was to do the LLB. Well, he'd already done the tripos because he'd been the star pupil of David Dalber.
That's right.
But he'd gone in 1950 by the time that I went to Keys. That's it. You see, I was at Queen, so I'd done the LLB, so I wasn't doing it in the same year. I'd finished 40 in 49. I think he came up in October. He came back in October 49 at Keys. But there was no link between us. It was his subjects for the LLB were different from mine.
Oh, I see.
He was doing the LLB in the same year as David Yale, whom of course I got to know quite very well because he did the legal history option, and I had to lecture to him. Yes, Peter, yes, he went off to Aberdeen, didn't he?
He did.
Nottingham
Yes.
first, and then on to Aberdeen. Yes,
Really
he
had
was
chair.
Nottingham for a couple of years. I know because he overlapped with my brother when my brother went there, in fact, slightly to Nottingham, and then he went off to Aberdeen. Yes, no, he was the star pupil. I should, by the way, have mentioned, of course, that he was no longer a fellow at the college, but David Dalber was a key. His college was Keys, and he took some very bright people for me in Roman law. But he would only take very bright ones with David.
Do you remember him?
Oh yes, very well,
Yes.
David. Yes. Oh yes, very well indeed. He was very serious, very and of course I could be particularly interested in his work because when I was doing negligence in English and Roman law, the article which had, as it were, made him well known in Roman law on the Lex Aquilia was essential to those lectures. So yes, no, he hadn't got a fellowship because he wouldn't do any teaching, so the colleges wouldn't give him wouldn't extend his fellowship. He had come over and been very largely brought over just before the war as a refugee, and by Buckland had made sure who was a Keys man. And Buckland was at that stage the president, vice master of the college, and very senior. He was in his 80s and things in prison. And he had got him a fellowship at Keys. That was before the war. But it went on, it was extended as long as we could possibly extend research fellowships. But he didn't really qualify for a teaching one because he was not willing to do 12 hours teaching, in all subjects.
Yes. Which does sound quite arduous, actually.
Oh, it was arduous, yes.
Yes.
It
I mean,
was arduous. It was arduous, but the undergraduates were far less demanding, far less demanding than they are now.
Yes.
They didn't want to be, as it were, spoon-fed. I don't wish to run down the present undergraduate, but they do expect everything to be laid out on a plate, and that was not the case then. Students did not expect it in the slightest, particularly the ones who were coming back. And there were many of them, you see, were older than I was when I was first when I first became a fellow. I started teaching at Keys the year before in that gap year when I still had to be a member of Queen's to qualify for the LLB. That's 49 to 50. I came across and supervised, but many of them were older, of course, naturally, of course, they'd been in the forces. But as it were, they had a sort of proper feeling for how much time should we spend on study and how much time on life.
Yes.
And generally speaking, you see, you didn't. Nobody taught between 2 and about 5. Well, the witching, that was sport, as it were, and then 5 to 7, 5 to 6 to 7, 2 hours solid. And the morning tended to be in the Squire and in lecture rooms there, and you expected undergraduates to go to lectures, and there were lots of them, and they would go through 4 of them, at least 3 a morning, you see. Lots of lectures they would go to. But supervisions tended to be, I probably underdid it, as it were. I didn't drive them nearly hard enough. But not having had much writing to do during the war, of course, at school and the rest, I never really acquired the habit of doing supervision. Well, never done any supervision essays and things myself. There were more discussions, and I think that would be true, generally speaking, all round. One wasn't expected to have spent the whole of the evening before reading the latest case, as it were.
And so exam-centred.
Yeah, it was exam, yes.
I mean, as it is today,
There wasn't. I think the exams were as tough then. They could be very tough. I mean, some of the papers Toby could set some tough ones, believe it or not. In English law, not just he was always very good there, but he could write English law, and they could be very tough on their examining. But no, it was just, there wasn't the same panic about exams, because frankly, almost most of the students said, well, the first for those who want to become academics, and and the rest, they were perfectly happy with 2-1s, or even 3rds, as it were.
Yeah.
They were, I'm not saying they weren't bright, and they were bright, as it were, but it wasn't desperate for them. People didn't attach to, just to classes in the exam the same.
No.
I mean, it was very nice if they got first in
Yes.
the rest and stood out and starred, but that wasn't what really counted. Yeah, and the bar didn't really expect everybody to get, either a first or 2-1. There wasn't that. They what they wanted were sort of people who could argue and present a case, and so that was it, you see. And
Yes.
so there wasn't the examination pressure. No.
No.
Oh no.
Different world.
It was that was a different world, yes,
Yes.
and they were, and they didn't expect things to be they weren't so spoon-fed. Though, to be frank, I have to say, what was carried on after the war, believe it or not, was sort of the university press would print some of the lectures to be handed out. Actually print them. The university press on a sheet of the headings and title and references.
Really?
So you got them ready, and they were printed by the university press before and handed out at the lecture. Oh yes, real very full, and that had virtually stopped by my time. But then really quite, I found that quite staggering.
Yes.
It's all like later when cyclostyle, things with cyclostyle and Xerox and all that came in. But for a long period, you didn't get that at all. Of course, there was nothing. There was no Xeroxes at all, and the old handwritten duplicators were not very appropriate. But I do remember that some of the very early lectures, people like Winfield and Holland still expected their lectures to be the headings and in the case references
Yes.
to be done out. Yes.
Were you ever taught by? You wouldn't have been taught by Holland.
I was taught by Holland. Oh, well, he lectured to me.
Right.
He was not the most inspiring. He wasn't a lively person at all. He was very punctilious. He had an enormous influence in the universities, and for the rest of my life I've been spending realising just what a part he played in the transformation of the university under the Royal Commission in 1923. I mean, he was acted as secretary of that commission, having had a distinguished war record, and most of college statutes, some of which are still and the wording, you couldn't improve on them. He drafted them, and he and Arnold McNair had an enormous amount to do, assisting Sir Hugh Anderson and people like that. I'm not sure that people quite realise just how much he did in setting up the structure of the university and the colleges in the interwar years. But he was virtually retiring. He was almost reached retirement by the time that I came up. And he was an extremely conscientious lecturer, but not a lively one. No, exact opposite of it. He was not a very lively lecturer, in fact. But then Winfield wasn't either, in fact, you see. They weren't lively in that sense. Some were lively, I mean...
were you ever taught by...
Arthur Armitage was lively, Jack Hampson, of course.
I wanted to ask you about
like
Hampson.
He didn't talk, but I mean, we discussed a great deal. Oh yes, he was a very live wire in the faculty in that 50-60 period and 60 to 70 period. Yes. Yes, he was lively. Yes. All this time, I should say, we were talking mostly about the 50s, 60s. Of course, Kurt was not a fellow of a college at that stage. He hadn't been gone. He was still what it was called a lector in Trinity. You see. But Trinity had got a number of fellows from inside, and a large number. They got Holland, they got Milsom, they got Wade, and then Tony Jolowitz and Ellie Lauterpacht, you see, so they were pretty well stocked. And so Kurt didn't have a college room, and he had the room in the Squire, and as you know, he virtually lived there all day long. And, in the same way that he did here, you know.
Yes,
I mean, he became a living legend.
Yes.
There,
Well,
even when I came up.
When you think, I mean, he'd been here since 1934. That is a long time.
Yes. Oh, yes.
To not
and he
have
kept that
facility.
car for most of those years, the blue Armstrong Sidley one. Yes. He used to tell me about what they'd done before the war. Yes.
When you say
it was a rather different Kurt before the war. I mean, very, you know, and Glamour Williams, they went off together in the car, sort of touring in Europe.
Really?
Oh, yes, but that was, yes. I never got to the bottom of exactly what happened there. Yes. But even after the war, he would take the Armstrong Sidley touring down to go to conferences. I remember he once took Geoffrey Wilson all the way down to a conference in northern Italy.
Good heavens.
That was Kurt. Kurt's Armstrong Sidley. What was it? He belonged to, what was it, Campbell, I think, and, you know, the chap who was the racing Campbell who was killed on the motor speed record, you know, the water speed record.
Yes. Do you mean that he bought the car from him?
He bought, I think so, but I'm not very good on
goodness.
it, as it were. But he kept that car going for many, many years.
Well,
That was long before Kurt became a fellow of. Kurt became a fellow at Trinity, Clare, where Bill left. Bill Widerman left. Bill had gone from. I went from Keys to. I went from Queens to Keys, and Bill Widerman went from Queens to Clare, as it were. Then, of course, Bill left for London. And we got Colin. First of all, we had Kurt and Colin, of course. And Colin's still there. Colin Turpin.
I was just going to say yes, that's right.
I talked to him. I lectured to him. I never taught him. But I lectured him. But on the Roman law, he was one of those.
He'd been presumably a student from Johannesburg.
Yes, that's right. Yes, he came up as a postgrad. In the same way that Bob Heppel later came up, you know.
Yes, somewhat more dramatic.
There was still very much a sort of link. There was the Roman-Dutch law link, very much so with South Africa.
Yes.
Many of the South African judges and chief justices had been to Cambridge. The chief justice family, you know, he was largely had been, you know, at Keys, in fact, long before my time. But
yes.
Arnold McNair and Emily Wade knew them well, all those. Yes.
Mr. Prichard,
sorry, I wandered off.
No, this is absolutely...
But it's only taken us to 60.
Yes.
There's a lot to come.
Absolutely. I mean, in this period, did you ever come across or have anything to do with Hirsch Lautpacht? He was the Newell professor from 1958
when I said
to
Lautpacht would come down, that was Hirsch, I was thinking of. Ellie was largely off down in London by that time, you know, very largely in London. Hirsch was in room 6. When I said going back, I was corrected. Hirsch, he was in international law, which was one of the subjects I never studied. We didn't do it at London University. I mean, it was one of the options, but only a third-year option. International law hadn't really spread. We were still very much 45, 46. But up here, yes, I always saw him almost every day in the Squire. He would come in, he was always punctiliously in by about 11 o'clock. I didn't say he started work, but he would meet, and the students would be there for a couple of hours beforehand, sitting outside on the long desks, and he would turn up and he'd see them one by one. And he was very much, as a research supervisor, he must have been a bit formidable. He knew so much, but he knew what he wanted from his students, and he got it, as it were, and they were very good.
Yes.
But he was always extremely polite and friendly, and he took a great part in in as it were, for the faculty. He didn't shirk his side of faculty work. He would always come down and talk in the faculty.
Yes.
Which was very helpful in the 50s and 60s, because we got quite a lot of people, with America having rather more money than anybody else and things, and we would tend to have them over from Harvard and places like that, and one of the ones obviously they would know would be her.
Yes.
Yes. Oh yes, yes.
I do remember some of the Goodhart incumbents commenting on the fact that how decentralised the faculty is for a visitor. I mean, there isn't.
What now?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
In contrast to earlier times, I'm just saying, people like Hirsch would have been very attractive to visitors.
Oh yes, yes. Well, visitors, or they would come. We'd see most of them during the day. Not just in the. There were rather fewer visitors. The colleges hadn't got so many individual things. The Goodhart professorship had not been set up, of course, but visitors would normally be on a short stay or something, or coming for lecture. They'd all come to the faculty.
Right.
Oh yes, yes. I mean, we'd meet most of them at things like tea in the morning.
Yes.
And always I remember meeting lots of them then. That was before the Goodhart professorship was set up in the.
Yes.
When was that? The late 60s, wasn't it? The first Goodhart professors. In fact, later than that, I think the 70s.
Yes.
In the 60s, if we had people over, they would be Pitt professors, which we had to share with economics and with history. But we had, as it were, a 1/3 share in the Pitt. I mustn't waste time, but it was always outraged me that the faculty was very weak-kneed, and when it got the Goodhart professorship, it allowed the economics representative of the General Board to, and no doubt with the history of it, to suggest that, and get it through the General Board, that since the law faculty now had its own visiting professorship, it didn't need part of the Pitt professorship. And therefore we lost our 1/3, and I'm afraid the faculty, I wasn't on it, I mean I would have thought it tooth and nail, that was in the, because of course Goodhart had given it as an extra chair, and there was no question, we should have had that, and as well as the Pitt. The Goodhart professorship was, as it were, entirely funded by Arthur Goodhart, and he didn't intend it to release the Pitt professorship. But we had some very good Pitt professors over, very good ones, who particularly Harvard and the rest.
That is a shame.
And I don't think we get Pitt professors now in law. Well, we don't, in fact. We get Goodhart, and far be it from me to tell you, we get a superb Goodhart professor. Excellent. Doing some, come back to Keys, but poor Finn, for instance.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, yes, but no, it was a fair, yes, it was pretty family type in the 50s to the 60s. 60s is a bit different. I'll talk about them in a moment. Yes.
Someone else who springs to mind whom people ask about was Henry Barnes.
Oh yes, I knew Henry Barnes. Yes, I knew, and Mrs. Barnes too. Yes, he was quite a character. He and Ashton Cross were the characters of the faculty. Henry had ceased to be by that time, as it were, a teaching officer of Jesus, but he did supervise, and he was a very popular supervisor in criminal law, and a very generous host too. When Dorothy and myself got engaged, he invited us round to lunch and in his rooms, because he used to live in his rooms above in Sydney Street, very roughly above where Sainsbury's, no, not now Sainsbury's, Sainsbury's and Move, or where Sainsbury's used to be a little bit further down in Sydney Street, opposite Sydney College. And I remember having a superb lunch with him, being offered the most superb wines, because he still was a remarkable judge of wine. Even though he wouldn't touch a drop, not by the time. Earlier memories, he had not been quite so abstemious, but in fact he became a complete teetotaler, as it were. Yes, but he was very much, one of the characters for undergraduates. Stories about being president of Mexico for a couple of days sort of approach. Yes.
And people used to flock to his lectures, apparently. In
Yes,
criminal law.
yes, they did. Yes. Not necessarily for the right reasons, but yes, no, he was. Arthur Armitage took over the criminal law from him, and he was also very lively, but in a totally different way. But that was before Glanville came back, of course. Yes.
Mr Prichard, let me ask you, are you happy to continue, or shall we...
I mean, it's up to you. Oh,
we've spoken
we've got far
roughly
too
an
long.
Yes. Hour and a half.
I mean, I must be going on far too long for you.
Oh, no. There are many...
The 60s, I should say the 60s, 70s were really very largely, just to warn your head, as it were. I was dragged in for 2 sessions as secretary, and secretaryship then was 3 years long. And at the end of the first session, so that was about 61 to about 64, 62 to 65, I took leave of absence, and Tony took over for a leave, but he couldn't stand the job. I'll explain.
Tony Weir?
Tony Jolowicz. Tony Jolowicz.
Right.
Poppy helped him, as it were. He quite rightly didn't like the job at all, and so the faculty dragged me back for another 3 years to try and initiate, or rather help and teach the new. By that time, the job had got so much that they decided they must have a faculty assistant. You see, you might say somebody more in the nature of Kirsty we got a retired lieutenant colonel, and they needed somebody to teach me. So I had 6 years as secretary. I don't think anybody else has ever had quite as long. And it was not. I mean, it was a happy period from the point of view, but it was a fraught and frenetic period for the 60s from the point of. But it's too late, I'm afraid, for me to tell you now at this stage.
Oh, I look forward
that
to
was the
hearing
battle,
about that next week.
battle with the old schools about the history, where we should be.
I would love to hear about that.
And also setting up Institute of Criminology and things, and it was an exhausting period of time, I have to say, because people quite rightly say this, the job of the secretary is terrible these days. I'm sure it is a nasty job, but in those days it was just to show you that we had to make the tax returns to the Inland Revenue, sign the P45s each year for everybody in the faculty we had paid. And I still remember, you finished your you finished your supervising in the Lent term, and you made your P45s for there weren't all that many of them, but we made the returns, we paid the checks until. But if I may, I better leave the secretaryship, which is, I suppose, because I know there'll be tributes to before me, but Mickey Dias and John Thornley, but I think I ought to leave that. But that was the period of the 60s, 60 to 70. The trouble was it ended in the chaos of the 68 student sit-ins and things.
Yes.
And the faculty, as it were, the law school building was never the same after that.
Right.
Bit by bit, we lost out room after room of the old. So the 60s from 70 to 80 was very largely a war of attrition in which the old schools took over more and more of the faculty. But in return, of course, we did at least get the downstairs Seeley Library. And also, too, the 60s, I should go back to the 60s, just as we needed a full-time professional assistant, but he didn't last. A very good man, Farrow, but he didn't last very long. So we needed, for the first time in the 60s, a professional librarian. Previously, Ellis Lewis had done it, you see, we all these jobs were done by members of the faculty until the mid-60s. But then, of course, Willie Steiner came, and after him, the series Gordon Hughes, and then Will Major, and then finally David Wills and people. But before that, it just fell. And rather all, you know, so the secretary of the faculty also had to act as secretary of the degree committee and liaise with the Institute of Criminology, which was not very easy at that 60s period.
No.
But that 60 to 70, which as I say was a fairly frenetic period, 70 to 80 was a slightly different one. 80 to 90 was a very different one too, when I came back for the faculty to help them computerise and computerise the examinations. But again, I'll have to leave that one.
Yes.
There's quite a tale behind that.
Ah.
But if I'm only really just qualified, you might say, to tell you about the faculty. I mean, but the links with the faculty have been rather long and detailed.
Yes.
But they may be of some help to people.
Thank you so much, Mr Prichard,
No.
for truly fascinating.
But I'm for you.
And
You've got a great list for more. 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 Great